everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. So the last episode of this podcast was quite intense, and since I'm planning on making this a bi-weekly podcast, I'm going to balance that out with today's episode, which is going to be a lot more, let's say, cold kind of political analysis. So it's going to be less me crying about, the sort of inconsolable grief and rage of the current moment, and more me sharing some of the thoughts and analysis that I've been having around shit that's going on in general. But before I do that, I've opened up a tip jar for this podcast. It's a website called buymeacoffee.com, and the whole point of it is for the price of one coffee, you can help support this podcast or whatever. I don't like the concept of a coffee, so I made it a Eid card, like an auntie Eid card or like a grandma Eid card, because those are always the best presents. So yes, if you appreciate this podcast and you want to help support it, you can do so by making one-time donations through this website, which I will provide the link below this episode. And yeah, think of it like a tip jar. Anyway, so the topic of today's episode is going to be it's not a new theory necessarily, but it's just something I haven't seen written in this way. And that is this concept of soft white supremacy. I use the word soft because I've heard it used for soft climate denialism. And I find that really interesting because I do see it more pervasive and actually more dangerous in some ways than hard climate denialism. And so what is the distinction? With hard climate denialists, we know these are the Trumps, the Fox Newses, the people who say it's all a hoax, or, go out and get a snowball. It's where's the climate change? This is kind of ridiculous. And it's usually packaged with other reactionary, ridiculous politics. And so it's a bit more identifiable. You know what I mean? It's Fox News, it's Donald Trump. But what climate activists have been describing as soft climate denialism is something that is much more present and much more prevalent. And you might have a lot of this. I mean, I certainly do. I find myself in and out of it. And a part of it comes in very different forms. Some of it, it's we can't do anything about it, or it's already too late, or it's this kind of, I'll recycle, but then I won't actively engage in climate politics or in demonstrations or whatever. It's sort of a liberal conception of climate justice, but also mixed in with some elements of delusion, of ideology, of nihilism. And again, it's much more dangerous when we're talking about communities in the global north who are largely subscribing to these things because they are not going to be the first and primary victims of climate collapse. In many ways, the first people, the first communities to be affected who are already being affected, are majority global south, for whom there are not these institutions and this sort of accumulated wealth like you have in the global north. These are literally the places where wealth and resources have been extracted and continue to be extracted. So there is this concept of soft climate denial. And again, very widespread. It's the kind of thing of if you see any newspaper or magazine not putting climate news on the front pages, that's sort of a form of soft climate denial. It's sort of that it's not this level of this emergency that it should be recognized as. If you remember the first few months of COVID, there was so much mobilization from media, from states, from whatever. This is an emergency and we're taking action. And you'd expect that based on the science of what we're seeing about climate change. So yeah, it's harder to pinpoint. And it's harder to call out because oftentimes it's what's not said. Anyway, so I've been thinking a lot about this, but in terms of whiteness. And here I reflected a lot on the conversation I had with Lina Munzir for this podcast, wherein she sort of moved away from using terms like white people I mean, it is a thing, and it's not, I mean, I completely disagree with anyone who says that it's racist to talk about white people in the same way that it's racist for white people to talk about black people. I'm already ignoring that, and that isn't what Lena was saying. But this conversation that we had came only a few days after the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell, and really demonstrating that, we are talking about values, we are talking about commitments and political commitments. And yeah, so it's not, I want to take just a moment to say that this is why I'm going to be talking about white supremacy, because in the grand scheme of things, I do accept and I do believe in a kind of universalism. And as hard as it might be at this current moment, it is still something that I hold on to. And that no one is born a certain way. When we talk about whiteness, we're talking about a social construct, an ideology. We're talking about an allegiance to a certain idea of what whiteness means. And a lot of people who are born, who are white, who come from white societies and white families and whatever, they benefit a lot from white supremacy, but they are not white supremacy themselves, you know what I mean? In the same way that there is a distinction between patriarchy and men. And so obviously men, here specifically cis men, benefit from patriarchy and oftentimes reproduce it and are the primary reproducers of that social construct, but they are distinct things. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. What I want to talk about is soft white supremacy. In the same way that I was just outlining the distinction between hard climate denialism and soft climate denialism, I'm sort of putting forth, I'm not going to go ahead and say this is a new theory, but it's definitely something that I've been working with and thinking about and working through kind of independently. I'm not really looking at other things. I did some very basic research. I'm sure this has been written and theorized before. Actually, if it has, and I don't quote anything of the sort, please feel free to send it to me. I would love to read. Well, actually, to be honest, I have been reading nothing these days. I am so exhausted. I don't know how to describe it. I'm talking a lot. Actually, I'm not even talking that much. Most of my talking happens in this podcast, but I've just been unable to read things. But anyway, all that to say, I have been thinking a lot about the more pervasive, quieter forms of white supremacy, often that are packaged with liberal ideals. So I've obviously been thinking about this ever since I moved to Vienna, and I was kind of confronted with whiteness daily, constantly. It's something that I'm aware of, and obviously my analysis leads me towards, before I left, one of the last things that I did in Beirut, the last few months, I became obsessed with bell hooks. And obviously she had this very famous phrase of white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy. And for me, it took me a while to understand the white supremacist part, because obviously there's like a kind of different configuration of like racial supremacy or of just domination in my region. So anyway, it was only when I came here that it became very, this is what I'm surrounded with. And if I want to have any important or relevant analysis, it has to incorporate that, because this is just my daily experience now. And I'm kind of forced to deal with white people, with whiteness, and ultimately with white supremacy. And so what I'll say before I begin, and why I've given such a long disclaimer, is because when I talk about white supremacy here, people do look at me strange, like, what are you talking about? And I find that so frustrating, and that's part of it. One of the first things about white supremacy, and here I'm talking about this sort of soft white supremacy, is the lack of recognition of whiteness as a power structure, and whiteness as a fundamental construct in imperialism and patriarchy and capitalism. Not really seeing that is part of the sort of ignorance that replicates and is found within these sort of spaces and ideas, first and foremost. I've been thinking a lot about this, especially since the protest I went to, which is this anti-racist protest, which was, I think, a good example of what I'm talking about when I say soft white supremacy, because this is not blood and soil. These are not neo-Nazis. These are regular people, parents, grandparents, whomever, just out and thinking they are against hate and saying we are against the far right. But in that same exact demonstration, you had a quite homogenous area of white people, the majority, and then a smaller group, let's say, of mostly migrants, mostly POCs, mostly marginalized communities, protesting for Palestine, protesting and saying and like sort of doing a small intervention of, if you're against fascism, if you're against right-wing politics and policymakers and whomever, then this is a huge thing. Like, this is, listen to the marginalized people. What are we saying? We're saying call for a ceasefire, call for whatever. And they were kettled by the cops and kept to the side. And all the while, the main performers, the main speeches were all addressing to and coming from white people. The music they played had nothing to do with anything, and it was just a feel-good moment for them. And so this protest was a good example of what I'm describing as soft white supremacy. Like, again, there's no banners, there's no specific thing, but functionally, that night was a really scary sign of those split worlds. I've been thinking a lot about this, especially lately, because I recently called out Contrapoints, who up until recently was one of my favorite thinkers. Contrapoints is a YouTuber, but for the purpose of this conversation, for my analysis, she is a public intellectual. And I have seen her as such. She has produced such interesting analysis and comparisons and media, that I found her inspirational. And I have been so incredibly fucking disappointed that for the last 5 months, she has said nothing. And I called her in a couple of times and wrote to her in the comment sections being like, hey girl, where you been? And so a few days ago, she releases one of her videos. It takes her months to make, and it's like a 3-hour-long thing. And what is it? Twilight. Like a 3-hour video about Twilight, the book series and then film series. And obviously it's about other things, and obviously it's going to be about power and love and eros and whatever bullshit. But something broke. I started yelling at her. I started typing these comments that I hate. I hate using social media in this way where it's like a vent, where it's just about getting whatever. But what the fuck? Where the fuck has she been? Like, when there are literally people, first of all, this genocide that's happening by her government, by her state, by her tax money, and not just that, a genocide creating ruins of an entire area, and then these gay flags being flown in that same area, which is the culmination of what we have been describing as pinkwashing. She has nothing to say about this. And instead she's living in her own kind of deluded media ecosystem. It's just so frustrating and so upsetting while we are languishing and crying and screaming. And again, here I'm going to keep it very specific. I'm going to talk about queer Arabs, right? What are queer Arabs saying? What have they been saying for 5 months? What have they been doing? They've been getting arrested. They've been screaming. They've been protesting. They've been shedding their blood. And then what are queer whites doing? Making fucking videos about Twilight like nothing's changed. And I'm sure she's out protesting and calling for a ceasefire. I'm sure she's donating. I'm not saying she's an evil person, but this is part and parcel. Here is a trans woman who has spent years on YouTube analyzing, dissecting, and kind of calling out the far right. So where do I get off? How am I here packaging Contrapoints into a conception of soft white supremacy? Well, I mean, if the fact that she's able to do this just is an indication for me that her heart is not broken by what's happening, that she's able to continue as though things are kind of normal, because for her things might be normal. And the sort of distance that is perpetuated between our pain and their joy, let's say, by people in our region wanting the world to stop, and people in the global north being like, no, we're just going to keep doing what we want to do. And it's just jarring and super fucked up because, again, now, with social media, with the availability of all this knowledge and images and speeches and words from not just people in Gaza, not just people in Sudan, not just people in Syria, but also people in the diaspora in the West who are speaking their language, who are speaking in English, who are in their streets, to ignore those voices and to ignore what they are saying is a form of complicity. And here is a form of remaining allegiant to an idea of white supremacy and a kind of bubble of white supremacy, wherein only certain voices exist and only certain lives are valued, And that's honestly a big part of it. And so to not be posting about Palestine when you can, and especially if you have a platform, is a form of erasure, is a form of ignoring, is a form of sidelining, and not taking certain risks because, I don't know, it just really upsets me. And honestly, I've been so disappointed by her. So back to the original point, you see, soft white supremacy is much harder to pinpoint. It's much harder to pinpoint than a kind of blood and soil white supremacy. But what are we describing when we see one side of a conflict just living their lives, going about things, complaining about normal, everyday bullshit, and one side, and again, I hate using the term conflict, but you get what I'm saying, sort of split worlds, but literally on the other end of the weapons manufacture, the weapons are created over there and they're used over there. And so for white people, or for anybody who A, can, and B, chooses to not let this affect them and move them, and if their life has not changed, this is a kind of allegiance to a soft white supremacy. Because in their world, within this bubble, within this frame of thinking, things are fine. Things can kind of continue based on the present circumstances. There's not that urgency that it needs to be disrupted, that I will just continue making the same content that I would have made a year ago, 2 years ago, that I will not be platforming, that I will not be highlighting and amplifying the voices of those marginalized. If 5 months of genocide has not moved them, then I am past the point of trying to reason, of trying to say, where are you? And trying to call in. I am in the point of calling out. And at this moment, I am starting to call it out for what it is. And I see this as a form of soft white supremacy. To not feel our pain. To think that all these things do not have anything to do with you. That it is their problem. That the Palestinians and the Arabs and the people of color, they're the ones who should be doing whatever. This isn't my thing. That's soft white supremacy. And that's why Bell Hooks herself would not talk about racism in so much as you talk about white supremacy. Because, as she'd say, it is their problem with us, with black people, with Arabs, with East Asians, with the rest of the fucking world. A funny little thing to finish this off, and I did not want to center this because I don't want this to make it seem like this is all about me, even though obviously a lot of this podcast has been very self-centered regardless. I made a post about a week ago on Twitter calling Contrapoints out on this, and she blocked me. I think it's the very first time I've ever interacted with her, and she blocked me. I mean, as in I've written to her several times, but this is the first time that I've gotten a response, and the response was to block me. And that to me is super fucked up. I loved her work. Her work has changed me. Her work has been so influential. Her whole style, everything. But the past 5 months, her silence. Again, white silence in the current moment, this is what I'm describing precisely as soft white supremacy. Silence is complicity at this point when it is their government and their tax money and their states and their whatever, that are doing this thing, that this is a continuation of the legacy of white supremacist colonialism and imperialism. Not just legacy, it's just happening right now. And again, it's just that same thing of what is Biden compared to Trump. Here we have this great example of a soft white supremacist. Again, he's not calling America, America first, but really summons this phrase, with liberals like these, who needs fascists? And it's the same here. Again, Germany, the fucking Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, is acting like a fascist to black and brown people. Like, not yet to white people. And this is what really scares me, is those who think they're safe and things are fine are really just waiting for it to affect them to kind of start listening to us and be like, oh, they were telling the truth. They were serious. Another really good local example is there was an article that was published just a few days ago in Der Standard, which is basically like the Austrian equivalent of The Guardian. So, lefty, progressive, or liberal rather, progressive, and educated. And it was a hit piece. It was a hit piece against queer activists for Palestine. And basically within the piece, the fundamental criticism was of post-colonialism as a concept, which is the right-wing talking point. It is kind of the intellectual version of anti-woke, So that's coming from the progressive liberal side of things, let alone their coverage of the entire genocide as a whole, which has been atrocious. That confirms the soft white supremacy of even these liberal, newspapers and media outlets. I don't know. I think this is why border violence and the entire concept of borders is super important and is really important here. Because the violence that's allowed to happen on the borders and also in the periphery will come home. And this is both a metaphor and quite literal. Because over the last decade, I think something that has shifted in Europe that Europeans, white Europeans, have not woken up to is how violent their borders have become. How their borders have become graveyards of black and brown migrants who are fleeing violence and economic precarity, much of which is a remnant, is a sort of a legacy of European colonialism and neo-colonialism. I mean, it's not lost on any of us that the RSF in Sudan get a lot of funding from the EU, that so many authoritarian states across the Mediterranean get funding from the US for the EU, specifically to prevent migrants and make it harder for them, and then get them on these rubber dinghies that then eventually drown in the Mediterranean. And Frontex, the border guards of the European sort of Union or whatever, have been pushing migrants back, have been doing things which are technically illegal, but regardless is incredibly fucking cruel. And so that's a kind of violence that people in Austria do not claim as their own, do not see as their violence. It happens over there. And I think it's very treacherous and, again, very difficult to call out. And so, essentially, to kind of wrap this all up, I think we need to expand our understandings of white supremacy to fit into the current moment. What are the threats of white supremacy? It's not just the slogans, it's not the costumes, it's not the whatever, it's the policies, it's the deaths and the violence and oppression that's allowed to happen, and who claims responsibility for it, and who has duties, and who is this violence sort of benefiting, regardless if they know it or if they've asked for it, White people did not ask to be born white, but nonetheless, it is a white supremacist world. And much of this violence happens on their behalf. And yeah, so I really think that understanding white supremacy, not as this fringe thing, not as this blood and soil, not as this, make America great again, but as the normal, continuous functioning of this sort of project of Europe. Not Fortress Europe, but Europe. The entire project of the United States, the entire project of what they are now calling Western civilization. That the sort of mechanisms that continue as normal, this is white supremacy. This is soft white supremacy. And so, honestly, that's a kind of analysis I don't want to make, because it's really fucking scary. But I have to call it out, and that's how I see it. And I think it's really upsetting because it's much more everywhere. But, I don't know. Again, as always, I hope I made at least one good point here. As always, if you want to send a message, please do so. I would love it, either on Instagram or email or Patreon. I really appreciate any feedback and comments I get. And especially for something like this, which is much more like an analysis, that hasn't been fact-checked or peer-reviewed. It is just me sitting here depressed and kind of trying to analyze my way out of this despair, but also analyze the situation in a kind of serious, honest way. And yeah, again, if you appreciate this podcast, there's a tip jar in the show notes. And yeah, that's been another episode of Politically Depressed. I'll see you all in the next episode.